There is a particular kind of frustration that nobody warns you about when you start doing this work. It's not the frustration of not knowing your patterns. Most people who have spent any time in therapy or reading about attachment or just paying attention to themselves in a relationship can name their patterns with reasonable clarity. They know the trigger, they know the wound, they can describe in some detail the old story their nervous system tends to tell. The frustration is that knowing all of that doesn't stop it from happening. The moment arrives, a tone, a late message, a small thing that lands wrong, and the reaction is already moving before the thinking brain has registered what happened. And somewhere in the middle of that reaction, there is a part of you watching it, knowing it's larger than the situation warrants, and completely unable to interrupt it. The self-awareness is real. The old wiring is also real. And in that moment, the wiring is faster. Today, I want to talk about why that happens, where the wiring comes from, and what starts to shift when you understand not just what the script is, but who wrote it and when. You're listening to Coupled With, the podcast that helps you take the guesswork out of feeling seen, heard, and valued in your relationship. If you've ever felt stuck in the same arguments, struggled to stay connected, or wondered how to better communicate with your partner, you're in the right place. I'm Dr. Rachel Orlick, a couples therapist and coach, and together, we're going to make relationships make sense. Let's dive in. Welcome to Coupled With. Today we're talking about the scripts that were written in your nervous system and how they show up uninvited in the middle of your closest relationships. Because the reaction that feels out of proportion to what just happened usually isn't. It's completely proportionate, just not to this moment, to a much older one. And until you can see that distinction clearly, you will keep having the fight that isn't actually about the dishes or the late text or the thing that was said at dinner. You'll keep having a fight that started long before this relationship even existed. Here's how it usually goes. Something small happens, usually not catastrophic, but something ordinary. A partner is late without a message, a plan changes without being consulted. A comment lands with an edge that might have been unintentional or might not have been, and the ambiguity itself is one kind of activation. Whatever it is, it's not dramatic from the outside, but inside, something has already moved. Before you've made a conscious decision about how to respond, before you've had a chance to evaluate what actually happened and what it actually means, the nervous system has already pattern matched. It has scanned the situation, found something familiar, and begun responding to the familiar thing rather than the present one. The door closes, or the temperature rises, or something goes flat and unreachable. By the time you're aware of it, you're already in it. This is what a filter does. Not a metaphor for irrationality, a literal organizing system built from every repeated experience of love, safety, conflict, and disappointment your nervous system ever cataloged. It doesn't evaluate each new situation from scratch. It asks, have I been here before? What happened then? What do I need to do right now to stay safe? And it answers those questions faster than thought. From the outside, this can look like an overreaction. From the inside, it feels entirely proportionate because it is proportionate, just to a different moment than the one that is currently happening. Most people can identify their childhood wounds with impressive clarity in a therapy session, and then activate them flawlessly in a parking lot 45 minutes later. The self-awareness is real. That wiring is also real. Both things coexist, even though they're somewhat inconvenient. And the person on the receiving end of the reaction, the partner who said the thing or was late or changed the plan, is now trying to make sense of a response that feels larger than what they did. They are not wrong that something is off. They just don't have the context for what they're actually in the middle of. And without that context, they can only respond to the behavior, which rarely goes well for anyone. Let me talk about where the filter comes from, because I think the word trauma does some people a disservice here. When most people hear that word, they think of events with clear edges, something that happened that was obviously harmful, that left a mark visible enough to name. And those experiences are real and they matter, but they are not the only kind of experiences that shape a nervous system. There is a category of experience that doesn't announce itself as damage. That is an ambient and repeated and quiet enough experience that it never got identified as the thing doing the forming. These are sometimes called little t traumas, not because they're lesser, but because they operate below the threshold of what most people think of as traumatic. And they are, in many ways, the experiences that do the most invisible work on a developing nervous system. Because they happen often enough and early enough that they become the operating system rather than an event within it. Let me name a few because I think it helps to hear them described rather than just labeled. There's the kind when love came with conditions. The child who learned that approval arrived when they achieved and withdrew when they didn't. Who became very good at producing, at performing, succeeding, being the version of themselves that most likely was to be praised, and very uncomfortable with needing. Whose nervous system built an equation early and below conscious awareness: do well, be safe. Needing something risks rejection. The equation is still running. It just has a more sophisticated context now. It shows up as the person who cannot ask for help without qualifying it, who struggles to receive care without deflecting, who keeps waiting for the moment their partner discovers they are not actually worth the effort. There's also the kind that was developed when everything was provided except emotional attunement. So the child who has stability and safety and the practical architecture of a functional childhood, who was fed and clothed and educated and in all measurable ways taken care of. What was absent was the felt sense of being emotionally met, of someone being curious about the interior experience, not just the grade or the behavior or the external circumstance, but the actual feeling underneath. That child learned that needs were handled, but feelings were not particularly relevant. That the interior life was, at best, beside the point. And they grew up very capable and very alone inside themselves. And they brought both of those things into every single relationship that followed. There's also the filter of when emotion itself wasn't safe, or it simply wasn't modeled. There are two versions of this, because they look different and land in the same place. The first, the household where emotional weather was unpredictable, where conflict, when it arrived, came with an intensity that felt dangerous. Not necessarily because harm was done, but because the emotional volume itself was frightening, and the child learned to stay small and undetectable until it passed. The second one, the household where emotion simply wasn't visible. Calm, functional, and emotionally opaque. Nothing expressed, nothing modeled. The child who grew up in that house didn't learn that feelings were dangerous. They learned by the complete absence of demonstration that feelings were probably not something you were supposed to have in front of other people. Both of those children grew up with a very complicated relationship to emotional expression. They just got there by different routes. None of these experiences were chosen by the child. None of them were the child's fault. And all of them became the filter through which every subsequent relationship, including the one they're in right now, gets read. Here is what is happening neurologically when the filter runs. Under ordinary circumstances, incoming information takes a longer route through the brain. It moves through the areas responsible for context, evaluation, nuance. That's the frontal cortex, which is completely capable of asking, what is actually happening here? What does this really mean? Is this as threatening as it feels? That route is slower. It is more accurate. And it is the route that most of us would prefer to be using in the moments that matter most in our relationships. But when the nervous system detects threat, real or perceived, present or pattern matched, from something older, it reroutes it. The signal goes directly to the amygdala, which is the brain's alarm system, and the amygdala responds based on what it already knows, based on the stored information from every time something similar happened before. It does not wait for context. It does not ask whether this situation is actually comparable to the one it's pattern matching. It just acts. Think about what happens when your car starts to drift across a lane. You don't deliberate. You don't think through the physics and decide to correct. Your hands are already moving before the conscious decision has been made. That speed is the point. In that situation, slower processing would be dangerous. The nervous system does the same thing in moments of relational threat. It corrects quickly because based on the information it has stored, you're in threat. The problem is that the information it has is often decades old. I want to tell you something personal here because I think it makes this concrete in a way that explanation alone doesn't. Early in my relationship with my husband, before he was my husband, when things between us were still new enough to be tender, I decided to make him dinner. He was teaching a lesson beforehand, and I timed everything carefully. The kind of care that goes into that timing is its own kind of vulnerability, if you think about it. Everything ready at the same moment. The effort made visible. When the food was ready, there was silence. No message. I reached out, and he was still at the lesson, sitting and talking with a student. She was a female student, which I will just say did not make the information land any more neutrally. By the time he arrived, the food was cold, and I was somewhere well past disappointment. The hurt was real. The disappointment was valid. I want to say that clearly because I think it matters. What happened was genuinely inconsiderate, and I was allowed to feel that. But the size of where I went, the speed of the escalation, the distance between what happened and where I landed, that belongs somewhere older than that kitchen. There was something familiar from much earlier in my life about feelings being dismissed. And then a series of relationships after that, some of them pretty serious and some of them long, where the script got written deeper. I wasn't prioritized. I wasn't chosen. I was never quite first. And then a moment of particular vulnerability with someone who had already required real courage to trust, where my nervous system found exactly what it had been trained to look for. His being late was real. The layer underneath it was older than him. And in that moment, my amygdala did not make that distinction. It just corrected the car. A tender spot is not a flaw in your character. It is a place where the nervous system learned to brace itself. Understanding that, really understanding it, is the beginning of having a choice of what happens next. The filter doesn't mean your partner's behavior doesn't matter. It does. What the filter does is intensify and shape the meaning of that behavior in ways that often belong to a different story than the one that is currently being written. Before we keep going, I want to pause for a second. Because if you've ever found yourself lying awake replaying an argument or doing more and more emotional labor in a relationship and quietly starting to feel resentful or panicking when your partner pulls away, there's nothing wrong with you. Most relationship advice tells you to just communicate better or calm down. But when your nervous system thinks connection is at risk, logic usually doesn't work very well. So I made a free 10-minute training called Why Love Feels Like Too Much, where I explain why these reactions happen and show you a simple nervous system reset that can help you stop the cycle before it escalates. You can watch it at the link in the show notes. So, the filter was built before you had any say in its construction. The amygdala acts faster than thought, and the old script runs in part because it was never named as a script. It was just experienced as reality. That changes what awareness of the pattern actually makes possible, because there are two very different ways this information can live in a relationship. In the first one, the script runs without context. The reaction arrives, larger than the moment, shaped by something older than the relationship, and the partner receives it without any frame for what they're in the middle of. They experience the behavior, the withdrawal or the escalation, or the distance that arrives out of what seemed like nowhere. And they do what people do when they don't have any context. They make up meaning. They decide what it means about them, about the relationship, about whether something is fundamentally wrong here. And they are usually not deciding in a direction that helps. In the second circumstance, the partner has been given the script, not as an excuse. The impact of the behavior is still real and still worth addressing, but as context. They know the tender spots. They know which moments are likely to activate something older. They know that when their partner goes somewhere fast and far, it is not only about what just happened. And with that knowledge, something different becomes available to them. They can move toward the wound rather than reacting to the behavior. They can stay in the room with more steadiness because they understand what the room actually contains. Sharing the old scripts with a partner is not weakness. It is not oversharing. It is a relational act. It is the decision to let someone close enough to you so that they understand you. Not just the curated version, but the version that includes the tender spots and the old wiring and the places where the filter runs hot. That conversation requires courage. It also has the potential to change what the cycle looks like when it becomes activated. Because a partner who has context is a partner who can choose compassion over confusion. And a partner who self-recognizes their own script can choose ownership. I want to name something honestly, because I think it is one of the most frustrating parts of this work and it doesn't get said enough. Understanding where the filter comes from does not automatically slow it down. Knowing the name of the wound does not stop the amygdala from pattern matching. You can have complete clarity about your childhood, your attachment style, the specific experiences that shaped your nervous system, and still find yourself in a charged moment, fully inside the old script with the thinking brain arriving late to a situation that has already been decided. That is not failure of insight. That is the difference between the frontal cortex and the amygdala. They are not in the same neighborhood. And intellectual understanding, however accurate and however hard won, lives upstairs. The old wiring lives somewhere so much faster. What begins to create distance between the filter and the reaction is not more understanding. It is repeated, embodied, noticing. The practice of recognizing the filter as a filter in the moment or close enough to it with curiosity rather than shame. Not, I am doing the thing again and I should be further along than this, but, oh, this feels familiar. This might be older than right now. Let me get curious about what is actually happening before I act from the story the amygdala is already writing. That noticing, practiced over time, begins to build something new alongside the old wiring. Not replacing it. The old script doesn't get deleted, but a second pathway, a moment of recognition that creates just enough space between the feeling and the behavior to actually make a different choice possible. That space is small at first, almost imperceptible, but it is where everything eventually changes. You don't have to have the old script resolved before you share it with your partner. In fact, sharing it before it is resolved is usually the point. Not because your partner is your therapist, it's because being known, really known by them, in the places that are still unfinished, is itself part of how the nervous system begins to learn that it's safe to be seen. The gap between knowing and changing is not a sign that you haven't worked hard enough. It is where the deeper work lives, and it is genuinely difficult to do that alone. Not because you're not capable, but because the nervous system learned its oldest lessons inside a relationship, and it tends to update them there too. The scripts that run your nervous system were not written by you. They were written by repeated experiences, some painful, some simply absent, some so ambient that they never announced themselves as formative until you saw them running in your closest relationships. The children who learned that love came with conditions, that the interior life was beside the point, that emotional expression was dangerous or simply invisible, that child built a filter, a way of reading the world that kept them as safe as possible, given what they knew at the time. That filter protected you. It organized experience into something you could navigate. It made sense of a world that was, in various ways, asking you to make sense of things no child should have to make sense of alone. And it is now running in a context it was never designed for. In a relationship with someone who is not the source of the original hurt, whose ordinary human imperfection is being read through a lens that was built for something much older. The cold food was real. The late message was real. The hurt was real. And some of what was felt in those moments belonged to a story that started long before this relationship, long before this person, and long before the moment that triggered it. That is not an indictment of your reactions. It is an invitation to hold them with a little bit more curiosity and a little less certainty. To ask yourself in the moments when the filter runs hot, how much of this is now? And how much of this is older than now? Not to dismiss what's real, to see it more accurately. The people who love you deserve to know what they're navigating. Not because you owe them an explanation for every reaction, but because being known fully in the places that are still unfinished is one of the most connecting things available in a close relationship. It changes what your partner can offer you, and it changes what you can offer yourself. The script was written before you could read, but you are not a child anymore, and you get to decide how much of it still runs. If you want the guided version of this work, my private audio series is linked in the show notes. You can start anytime. That's it for today's episode of Coupled With. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love for you to hit subscribe so you never miss what's next. And if you found it helpful, please share it with a friend or leave a quick rating and review. It really helps more than you know. And if you're curious about how we might work together or want more resources to strengthen your relationship, head over to my website, www.drrachelorlick.com. You'll find free tools, podcast extras, and ways to go deeper. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.